tell us what your own position as George Coyne is on evolution and intelligent design?
Okay, my position as George Coyne, and I think it represents a significant number of Catholic scientists, is the following: that the best scientific explanation we have of the origin of the universe and everything in the universe, including all living systems and ourselves, is by what I call neo-Darwinian evolution.
Well, I clearly agree with that, and I believe that Pope John Paul II would have agreed with that as well.
He certainly said very officially in a very official document to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that evolution is no longer a mere hypothesis. I avoid the word theory.
Yes, me too.
Because certainly in American English, theory gets the idea of it's only a theory.
Yes.
It's someone's idea.
Yes.
Where it is the best scientific explanation, and it does not at all contrast with any Catholic teaching.
Right, okay. But I think they'd probably want, I certainly would want to make a distinction between acknowledging that on the one hand and trying to bring in something supernatural on the other.
The idea of bringing in something supernatural, I think, is a caricaturization of what religious faith is all about. A scientist or any other human being can accept or deny the supernatural. But what you cannot do is on scientific, strictly methodological scientific grounds, deny the supernatural.
No, I think I agree you can't actually deny it, but isn't it then part of a very large population of things that you can't deny, for which there's no positive evidence? I mean, you can't deny fairies at the bottom of the garden, but neither of us take it seriously. So
positive evidence is a key word here, I think.
But is there any?
Oh, there sorely is positive evidence for the supernatural, but it goes outside the scientific endeavor, because the scientific endeavor, by its methodology, is limited to explaining natural events by natural causes, or if you wish, I don't like to use the word material, but we can use it in this context, material events that we observe by material causes, and it's limited to that. But it is limited to that.
But you've used the word evidence. What sort of evidence are you speaking of?
Well, I'm speaking of the whole traditions from, at least 2,000 years before Christ up until modern times, but the whole of Judaic Christian literature, of Islamic literature, of church traditions that have been passed on since the founding of the church, etc. They are all well-established human endeavors. Now, you can examine those and accept them, or you can examine them and reject them, but they have to be examined. They are clear evidence outside of science. I mean, they're not tricks. Somebody is not tricking us into believing in the supernatural.
No, but they're evidence that in these traditions people thought certain things, but that doesn't mean that what they thought was right. It's hardly evidence just that people for 2,000 years have thought something, is it?
That is correct. That is correct. But if I examine what they've thought over this long period of times, I find that I can, without divorcing my whole rational structure, I can accept that. I do not find that I, as a person and as a scientist, am sort of schizophrenic. That is, I'm being strict about my scientific methodology, but I'm being juvenile. I'm being non-rational. I'm being non-inquisitive when I accept scriptures and church tradition and all that comes with them. I think it's coherent.
Yes. You mentioned both the Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition. These are not the same.
Buddhist? No,
yes. So how do you decide which one? I mean, you're a Catholic priest. Why light upon that tradition rather than any of these other ancient traditions?
It's because of my history. All of us have our personal history, which we struggle with. I mean, I grew up in a very Catholic family, okay? Does that mean that I've been duped? I grew up in a Catholic family. I went to Catholic school.
But if you had been brought up in an Islamic country, you'd be a Muslim, therefore.
Probably so. I mean, we are all subject to our personal histories. I can't deny
we clearly
it.
are, but doesn't that undermine your feeling of validity of the one you just happen to have been born into?
No, because this is a faith statement now. It's my firm belief that God deals with each of us in his own way.
So the Muslim's beliefs which contradict yours are equally valid in his personal history and therefore equally valid?
That's a very challenging question. I would say there are ingredients of God's speaking to the Muslim tradition, to the Buddhist tradition, to the Catholic tradition. There are elements of God's true revelation to these people in all of those traditions. Each of us wants to make our own claims. I think it's always wrong for any of the traditions to claim that they have the absolute truth, that they are the ones that God really speaks to. I think that's a caricature of what happens, but it has happened in history, of course. We have to face that.
Why don't you accept those things which are universal, like the existence of God? Why do you, in addition, accept those things which would be contradicted by these other traditions, like I don't know whether the virgin birth or some part of the Catholic tradition which is particular to the Catholic tradition?
Because besides, believing in the existence of God, I firmly believe that God has spoken in a very special way, through the Jewish tradition up until the birth of his own son. I firmly believe that Jesus Christ is true God and true man, sent to us by God to save us. That's all my religious tradition, and I find that is not incoherent with my life in general, and certainly not incoherent with my scientific pursuits.
No, not with that, but with the possibility that you might have been brought up in a different tradition and would believe something that really did contradict it.
Yes, okay, we're speaking now, if I could, sort of broaden the discussion, we're speaking about a very short period of human history, much less an extremely short period of cosmic history.
Indeed, yes.
So if we're living in a universe that's 14 billion years old, human civilization, how far back will we date just the first human being? Some fraction of a million years?
Yes, I mean, but that you wouldn't want to call that civilization.
No. And then, religious history, certainly Judeo-Christian tradition from, I would say, roughly 2,000 years before Christ up, and these are very short periods of time. Who knows, in the whole kind of more cosmic universal view of things, that the religious traditions will not eventually unify.
What do you say to fellow Christians who take the book of Genesis literally, and Adam and Eve and 6 days and things like that?
I tend to get very upset by it, any literalist, fundamentalist interpretation of Scripture, because it simply reveals, I hate to be this harsh with people who are real believers and very religious, but it does, because it reveals a very fundamental ignorance of what Scripture is all about. And let me put it this way. Scripture was written between, let's say, 5,000 years, at least the traditions back to the prophet Abraham, the patriarchs, until about 200 years after Christ, which is the Gospel of St. John. That's the span of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. Modern science came to be in roughly, in the 17th century, with Galileo on through Leibniz and Newton. There is no science in Scripture. There can't be, because of that conflict of dates, but they had no scientific mentality. They had no curiosity about how old was the universe, how did various things come to be.
But if the book of Genesis was written by fallible humans who didn't really know anything, in what sense is it God speaking to us?
That's a very good question. We really truly believe that God, working through these various cultures, that these writers were inspired to give the foundations for a religious tradition. What that inspiration means, what it doesn't mean, is God was not dictating to these people. That's clearly absurd to think that. But they were people of faith and a deep religious tradition, and that God was really working with them, okay, through their faith in creating a literature that would be foundational for future religious belief. I mean, what intelligent design? In fact, I call it the intelligent design movement. And what it is, it's a mistaken attempt to try and use science to establish the what I call the implications of science, that is, going beyond science to the philosophical, theological interpretation. So what intelligent design does, it begins with biology. And I'm not a biologist, so you correct me, but they offer various possibilities, you know, blood clotting system in the human being. And various
Well,
things.
they're effectively looking for gaps that in present scientific
correct.
understanding,
Yeah. They
from
say
a scientific
that
point of view, is
there
waiting to
are
be plugged.
irreducibly complex biological systems, and you can explain that better than I can, that cannot be explained within the scientific method and require an intelligent designer. And in every case that they have suggested, and Ken Miller has, as you know, analyzed each of these cases, and you have, I'm sure, too. But Ken Miller, within the Catholic tradition, as a biologist, simply says, none of it holds up. We can explain it. If you carefully examine what evolution does, you can explain this.
But do you think then that the soul entered at some point in evolution, Australopithecus, Homo erectus? Is it that kind of question?
I don't believe in the soul.
No.
I mean, if it's a question of belief, I don't believe this idea of, at some time in the evolutionary process, God put a soul
I think
into a
Pope
certain
John Paul
organism.
II implied that that is what
Well,
happened.
Catholic tradition can be interpreted that way, but it's certainly not, it's not a doctrine that I have to believe and I don't believe.
Okay.
I simply think that, at best, I like to think about, as Teilhard de Chardin did, about the spirit emerging in this whole evolutionary process, that the whole process is continuous, and that from the material evolution, the spirit arose, however we define the spirit. It came through the evolutionary process. And God, of course, is working with it all along, so I'm not taking God out of the process. In fact, I'm putting him more into it than a God who sort of puts his finger at a magic moment into this evolutionary process.
You do think it arose during, there must have been an animal that didn't have a soul, and then a subsequent animal
yes,
that
but
did.
as all of evolution, as you know better than I do, Richard, all of evolution is continuous. The passage from inorganic to organic, from vegetable to animal, from one kind of animal to another. We can't decide, you know, when this little fish became a reptile,
No, indeed.
can we?
No, indeed.
So
no.
it's the same with the rest of this process.
But if you
sir.
believe that the soul survives death, then you would want to say...
Oh, now. I believe I survive death. Now, the mystery of that, I don't believe my soul does. I do.
But do you...
I mean, in the afterlife, I surely want to have a gin and tonic and play some tennis. But how that's going to happen, it's a mystery.
But do you believe chimpanzees survive death?
No.
And so, nor the common ancestor? Yeah.
Not necessarily. I can't say they don't, but
So there
I
must have
believe
been
I do.
a first animal in evolution that survived its own death.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
We always have to ask that question of, was there a first? And yeah, we have to say there was a first, but we don't know when, how.
Okay.
So we have come from apes, if that's true, and that would have to, of course, as you know very well, be more specified. But let's say we've come from apes. That does not make me an ape. I mean that evolution is very creative and brings about and has brought about a human being that is not reducible to its antecedents.
So it's faith and you can't question faith.
That is correct. I cannot. It's too deep inside me.
Thank you very much indeed. This was a
pleasure.
fascinating conversation.